Hi, my name is Carlos. I'm a food researcher in Brazil, and I'd like to thank the fourth conference on innovations in food science and human nutrition. The work is entitled Extrusion Cooking of Gluten-free Whole Grain Flour Blends. This work was conducted in our lab in Brazil in cooperation with the students of the University of Rural of Rio de Janeiro, which is also in Rio de Janeiro. Right. This Embrapa is a government institution. It's funded by the Brazilian government and other grants. So our headquarters is in the capital of Brazil, and then we have also almost 40 units spread all over Brazil. So our thematic center is about food science and technology, which is here in Rio de Janeiro. We also have other product centers and eco-regional and agroforestry centers spread all over our country. So let's start the talk, initiating our conversation about the problem. The problem is we have some obesity is growing up in Brazil and has very high correlation with neoplasia. I mean, talk about cancer. So this data here is from National Institute of Cancer. And you see one of the cancer that is concerned us most is a colon rectum cancer, which affects around 8 to 9% of women and men. And then based on this data, which is much more related with diet, we thought we could contribute. So still talking about the problem, we have, for example, like low consumption of dairy fiber. For example, female consume less fiber in urban area than the rural area. And also the same phenomenon happens with men, although men consume a little bit more fiber than women, around 5% more fiber than female. Right. And another problem that you have to address is concerning heart disease. Recommendations of reduction heart disease is the use of medication, interventional procedure in such difficult cases, and adoption adequate lifestyle. Nutrition aspects are very much related, and also with physical exercise are very important to reduce the risk of heart disease. One thing that's very important in our lab, we work with cereal. So because we talked earlier about the importance of eating fiber, let's tell you that rice, maize, and sorghum are the main cereals we have in Brazil that we produce it, and they are gluten-free proteins. We have here, so you can see the complexity of the outlayer of those cereals. Although the internal part of the which we call endosperm is basically starch, around 60 to 70% starch. In liquids, around the German, which is more or less about, depends on how cereal you're talking about 5 to 10%. You have the pericarp. The pericarp is a region you have a lot of fiber. Mostly fiber is insoluble fiber. For example, here you can see, you can see if it's in my mouse, but you have this typical layer called pericarp, a layer on a layer, and then down internally you have starch. So when you have refined flours, what remove? You not remove only the germ, but you also remove the pericarp. And then the importance of the nutritional contribution of the cereal is obviously is the protein. When you have whole grain, you have increasing protein, increasing vitamin minerals. The lipids are kept in the flour, and the phytochemicals Phytochemicals usually are responsible for the pigments, the tannins. For example, one important source of tannin is sorghum. Although sorghum in Brazil mostly are non-tannin, so we have genotypes recommended for human nutrition with tannins, which increase the bioactive uh, response. So dairy fiber then is preserved. So with pigments, phenolic compounds, and dairy fiber, you have at the end a contribution to reduce those or prevention of those diseases such as metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. So one technology that can be used to produce products like expanded snacks, biscuit, pasta, and pre-cooked flour is thermoplastic extrusion. So then you have, for instance, the whole cereal that has to be milled. The particle size is a very important uh, function during the extrusion process. And here in Brazil, we have twin and single screw extruder. Here you have a torque rheometer, which is represented by motor drive. So this is the motor, the torque rheometer we have in our lab. And attached to it, you have a single screw extruder that you have several types of screw compression. So once you have a very fine particle or coarse particle, depends on the type of the extruder you have to keep it to fill the feeder, and then you control the speed of feeder, the feed rate, the screw, the velocity of the screw or rotational speed, and then you attach to it a die. A die, it's a very important that you have the constraint that you can increase or decrease the back pressure, and then you have different products come out of the extrusion process. Here you have an example of expanded extrudate that we produce with one part of each cereal, rice, maize, and sorghum. And then by milling, you can have whole grain cooked flours that can have very varied applications, such, for example, production of gluten-free breads with high fiber content. Let's have a look on the extrusion process. So extrusion process is a combination of heat, mechanical shear, and as a result, inside pressure inside the extruder. Here, then, when as a result, you have a stretch and a cutting down of the starch granule, because water usually when you want expanded exudate, you usually operate uh, 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 at low moisture content, below 40, and precisely in our case here, you produce our extrude at 14% water content. Here you have, when you are producing with certain degree of water, you may have remnants of starch, but you can see how small is the molecule that is formed. That's different from the starch granule, but then you have a matrix. This matrix, this type depends on how extrusion was carried out. It can have different viscoelastic properties can make it useful for other type of products. So the idea was to evaluate the extrusion process using a single screw extruder to run whole grain flours. And then this is the picture of our extrudate. This is a picture of the product you use, and then you mill, you produce a flour. So each of these grains has your own contribution. For example, the yellowish dot, the maize, they contribute with beta carotenoids. Has polyunsaturated fatty acid, a natural antioxidant occurs. In brown rice, you have oryzanol, phytosteroids, and also is considered a hypoallergenic grain. Sorghum, and also have the color of the pericarp, which is rich in pigments. Some of them has tannins. The one we used had tannin, and polyflavonoids too, which can be used for increase antioxidant activity. And then by starting the experiment, all grains were clean and then male as a whole, and then you produce and you characterize the flour concerning chemical composition, particle size, and then you run the before and after the past viscosity readings, which give an idea how the behavior, how the effect of the extrusion that affect after the process. And then you have the basic measure of expansion, those expansion index, for instance, sectional, longitudinal, volumetric, and the texture analysis once it's important if you want to give those snacks for human consumption. And then you run a mixture of those raw products, keeping a constraining of 15%. And just a picture to show that for this kind of extrusion, for the single screw extruder, we use a coarse particle, mostly above or around 1 millimeter. So there was coarse particle size. For example, if you run in a twin screw extruder, you may prefer fine particles, and depending also of the how feeding rate can be done. And here, just to give you an idea that, for example, those whole cereals, they have more, considerable amount of dairy fiber, particularly maize and sorghum, and low rice. So rice, some of the pericarp is lost during the process of taking the hull off during the milling process. And you can also see the contribution of protein. See, sorghum protein is almost 70% more than others. Calcium, iron, zinc, and phosphorus, we also a reasonable concentration on this type of this genotype, sorghum genotype. And of course, as a result of adding more or less one of those ingredients, you have you're going to reflect on the final product. For example, those with reasonable amount of all of them, you have a reasonable amount, for instance, for example, of protein. So you can increase the protein a little bit more when you have the additional of sorghum, for instance. And then these are the data you collect from the extrudates, and here is the expansion indexes. Here is the density. This is apparent density. And these are the data, those three, CV, BDV, SBV, they are data we read from the RVA or paste viscosity readings. And also there's two readings of the texture of the expanded exudates. So it means that, for example, 3 here is it's rice. So rice increase the crispness of the exudates. So let's also have a look on the contour plot. For instance, sectional expansion index, you see how rice has contributed to increase the expansion of the exudates. You're going to see the next picture image of the expanded exudate cross section. And also what you see is the volumetric expansion is very much related to the sectional expansion density. The higher the density, so the lower the number of pores. So the exudates of sorghum and maize were more dense than those produced with rice. Here the picture cross-section of the extrudates that come out of the die. And you can see when you increase rice, you increase, remember that rice has lower fiber content, lower than sorghum and maize, and see an increase in expansion, larger bubbles and larger size. And when you had sorghum, you have low, the greater number of small bubbles, you can see, and a mix of them. Here you have 1 to 1 to 1. So T7, T8, T9, T10 is the runs of the same formula. You see that the color that match in between the color of sorghum and the yellowish, the brownish of sorghum and the yellowish of maize. See, let's have a look on the texture. So again, sorghum at the top, the base are maize and rice on the right. As you can see, crispiness, surprisingly crispiness increase when you increase sorghum. Why? Because somehow crispiness is a result of the number of cells that is broken when you run the texture analyzer. The greater the number of small cells, the greater the number of crispiness. And there has to be also related to the hardness. So let me have a look. And as a conclusion, so was possible to produce gluten-free whole grain flour brand using single screw. So it means that you can use the flours of whole grain in order to use refined with a very interesting characteristics of expansion and crispness. And then mixture that blends with sorghum and maize reduces the expansion, but in case of using sorghum, still kept crispness, which are very interesting properties. Of course, the color of increase and darkness when you use sorghum. It's good to remind that sorghum has many different color of the pericarp, and then can be used from whitish to blackish, so color depends which genotype you have available. So there was a tendency of low retrogradation when you increase the fiber content, but basically when you use more maize and sorghum. And we have a low coat viscosity and low breakdown viscosity when you use more maize into the mixture, which might be attributed to the high lactic content present in this and in maize. So that's the end of our talk. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of PAPER, CNPQ, and the contribution of the students of the University Federal Rural of Rio de Janeiro. Thanks a lot for your presence here. I hope you've enjoyed the event. And once the pandemic is getting under control, we very much welcome you to Rio de Janeiro. Thanks a lot.